20 illegal European foods that were banned for being too dangerous. Number 4 on this list was eaten by French politicians in secret with a napkin draped over their heads so God couldn't see them do it. Number 11 is technically still radioactive, right now, tonight, and people are still eating it. Number 1 was once declared a national symbol, then the government banned it, then the people kept eating it anyway. And somewhere in the middle of this list, number 8, there is a cheese. A living, moving, maggot-filled cheese that is illegal to sell in the European Union, but illegal to not make in the village where it was born. 20 foods, real bans, real reasons. And a few of them will make you wonder whether the food was ever the dangerous thing or whether it was us all along. Hi, welcome to Forgotten European Foods. Stay with me, because this one gets strange. Europe is old. And I don't mean that in a polite, cultural heritage kind of way. I mean Europe has been feeding itself for thousands of years through plagues and famines, through wars that swallowed entire generations, through winters so brutal that entire cities learned to eat things they never would have chosen in better times. And some of those foods survived. They made it through the Middle Ages, through 2 world wars, through the Black Death, through the kind of poverty that modern people cannot really imagine, the kind where you eat the rind of the cheese, because throwing away anything at all was a sin against your own survival. And then in the 20th century, something happened. The European Union was born. Committees, directives, food safety panels, scientists in rooms with fluorescent lighting deciding what a continent of 500 million people was allowed to put in their mouths. And some of the oldest foods in the world, foods that had fed soldiers, shepherds, fishermen, and kings, didn't make it through. Not because they were bad. Not because they were dangerous in the way we usually mean dangerous, but because they were old. They were raw. They were alive. They were strange. They were the product of desperation and ingenuity and centuries of trial and error that no lab could replicate and no committee could fully understand. This is the list of 20 of them. This is not a list of things that will kill you. This is a list of things that survived everything and then got a fine and a cease and desist letter. Let's count them down. Number 20, Casu Marzu, Sardinia, Italy. This was the cheese people made when they had nothing else and no one to impress. Casu Marzu is a traditional Sardinian sheep's milk cheese. It is also, depending on your perspective, either the most complex fermented food ever made by human hands or a container of living maggots that you eat with your eyes closed. Here is what it is. Plainly, standard pecorino cheese is left outside, partially uncovered, so that the cheese fly Piophila caseae can lay its eggs inside the rind. Those eggs hatch. The larvae eat through the cheese. Their digestive systems break down the fats, and what is left is a soft, almost liquid paste that runs from the wheel like something melting. The maggots are still in there when you eat it. They are alive. They can jump up to 15 centimeters when disturbed. Some locals eat it with the larvae still present. Others remove them first. The most traditional way involves pressing your thumb directly into the paste, scooping it onto flatbread, and not asking questions. The survival value is this. In a place like Sardinia in the 19th century, rocky, hot, isolated food that could ferment itself was food that asked nothing of you. No refrigeration. No special equipment, no special skill. The fly did the work, the maggots did the aging, and the result was a calorie-dense, protein-rich food that lasted. The EU banned it under food hygiene regulations in the 1990s. Officially, the concern was parasitic infection. The larvae, if swallowed alive, could theoretically survive in the intestine and cause damage. The Sardinians did not entirely agree with this assessment. And here is the extraordinary thing. In 2010, the EU recognized Casu Marzu as a traditional food of Sardinia under protected designation, which means it is technically legal to make and consume, but not to sell commercially, so you cannot buy it. But if someone gives it to you, you can eat it. On a small island off the west coast of Italy, that distinction matters deeply. This was not food. This was fermentation taken to its absolute limit. And somewhere in Sardinia tonight, someone is eating it. Number 19. Ortolan bunting, France. This was the meal that required a confession afterward. The ortolan is a small songbird. It weighs about 25 grams. It is the size of a thumb. For centuries, and some say still today, in the countryside of southwestern France, it was considered the ultimate gastronomic experience. The final meal, the thing you ate before you died. Here is the tradition, exactly as it was practiced. The birds were caught alive in fields using traditional traps. They were brought indoors and kept in darkness, a box or cloth-covered cage which confused their internal clock. Thinking night had become permanent, they ate and ate and ate, doubling their body weight in fat. Then they were drowned alive in Armagnac brandy. Then they were roasted whole and eaten whole bones, organs, feet, skull in 1 or 2 bites. And the napkin. The napkin was draped over the diner's head while they ate. Some said it was to concentrate the aromas. Some said it was to hide from God. Most honest accounts suggest it was both. François Mitterrand, the president of France, ate ortolan as his last meal before he died of cancer in 1996. It was reported widely, and it was already illegal. France banned the hunting and eating of the ortolan in 1999 under pressure from the EU and in compliance with the European Birds Directive. The bird's population had collapsed 90% decline over 40 years. The trapping was taking too many birds from a species already in crisis. But the tradition did not disappear quietly. There have been regular reports of secret dinners, underground markets. Illegal trapping continued deep in the Landes region. Fines were issued. Raids were conducted. And still, because the ortolan represented something that is very hard to legislate out of existence, the idea that a meal can be a ceremony, that eating something can be an act of grace, or transgression, or both at once. This was not cooking, this was ritual, wrapped in a napkin, with a glass of Armagnac, and the knowledge that it cost something. Number 18. Absinthe, Switzerland, France, and across Europe. This was the drink that Europe decided was making people go mad. And for a time, it seemed like it might have been right. Absinthe is a high-proof spirit made from grand wormwood, anise, and fennel. It is bright green. It has an anise flavor that coats the tongue. And for the better part of a century, it was the drink of artists, poets, soldiers, and working-class Paris in ways that no other spirit had ever been. Van Gogh drank it. Toulouse-Lautrec drank it. Oscar Wilde wrote about it. Hemingway drank it in the Spanish Civil War and wrote about the way it changed the light. Then came the bans. Belgium banned it in 1905. Switzerland, where it was invented, banned it in 1910. France banned it in 1915. Across Europe, one by one, the green fairy was outlawed. The stated reason was thujone, a compound found in wormwood that, in laboratory studies, caused seizures in rats at high doses. The assumption was that heavy absinthe drinkers were being poisoned by thujone, that it was a psychoactive compound that caused hallucinations, madness, and the particular wild destruction associated with the bohemian world of late 19th century Paris. The science, as it turned out, was almost entirely wrong. Modern analysis of antique absinthe bottles has shown that the thujone content was far too low to cause any psychoactive effect at all. The madness associated with the green fairy was almost certainly the effect of very high alcohol content, 60 to 80%, combined with rampant poverty, poor nutrition, adulterated products, and the psychological pressure of living in a world on the edge of collapse. The bans lasted for nearly a century. Absinthe was re-legalized across most of the EU in the 1990s and 2000s, with thujone limits regulated. You can buy it today in most of Europe. Wait, here's what no one tells you. We are 3 items into this list, and already a pattern is forming. None of these foods were banned because they were uniquely lethal. None of them were secretly causing mass casualties. The maggot cheese had been eaten for centuries with no recorded epidemic of intestinal larvae. The songbird had been eaten for generations without collapsing French civilization. The green fairy had been consumed by some of history's most productive creative minds. What got them banned was modernity. The arrival of centralized food safety, which is genuinely important and also, occasionally, completely incapable of understanding the difference between a food that carries risk and a food that is risk itself. What gets remembered as a dangerous food is sometimes just a food that could not be explained by a committee. Keep that thought, because it comes back. Number 17. Hackerel. Hackerel is fermented Greenlandic shark. It is made from the Greenland shark, a fish that is, in its raw state, genuinely toxic. The flesh contains high concentrations of trimethylamine oxide and urea, which break down into compounds that cause neurological symptoms, disorientation, and, in sufficient quantities, death. So the Icelanders figured out how to make it safe. And their solution was not refrigeration, it was not cooking, it was time. The shark is gutted, beheaded, and buried in gravel or sand for 6 to 12 weeks. The pressure of the gravel and the natural drainage of the ground allow the toxic compounds to leach out of the flesh slowly. Then the meat is hung in a drying shed open to the wind for another 3 to 5 months. By the end of that process, the toxins are gone. What remains is a brownish, rubbery meat with an ammonia smell so powerful that first-time visitors to Iceland sometimes gag at the door of the shed before they ever taste it. Gordon Ramsay famously spat it out on television. Anthony Bourdain called it the most disgusting thing he had ever eaten. Andrew Zimmern, a man who has eaten living insects, fermented entrails, and raw testicles on national television, said it was the single most challenging food of his career. Hackerel is not technically banned by the EU. Iceland is not an EU member state. But it is restricted. You cannot import it commercially into EU countries under standard food safety directives because the fermentation process does not meet regulated hygiene standards. It occupies a legal gray zone across the European continent. In Iceland, it is eaten at midwinter festivals. It is chased down with a shot of brennivine, a strong Icelandic spirit, because the alcohol blunts the ammonia hit. 1,000 years ago, when a Viking settlement needed to survive a winter with no other protein source, a buried shark was the difference between life and death. The process that made it edible was not disgusting. It was genius. Number 16. Surströmming, Sweden. This was the food that got banned from apartment buildings. Surströmming is Swedish fermented Baltic herring. It has been made since at least the 16th century, when Swedish soldiers and sailors needed a protein source that could survive long journeys without refrigeration. The herring is caught in spring, lightly salted just enough to prevent rotting, not enough to cure, and then left to ferment in barrels for several months. The result is then canned. And here is where it gets interesting. The canning does not stop the fermentation. It continues inside the can, which means the can continues to expand. Surströmming cans bulge visibly on the shelf. Opening one indoors is considered an act of either great courage or terrible social judgment. The smell has been described, by scientists who have actually studied it, as one of the most putrid fermented foods on the planet, outranking natto, durian, and aged Limburger. The compounds include hydrogen sulfide, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. The experience of opening a can has made adults cry. Animals flee. Neighbors call. Airlines ban it as cargo. Germany banned it from certain apartment complexes. In the 1990s, a court ruling upheld the right of a landlord to evict a tenant who opened a can in a communal space. South Korean Airlines banned it completely. In Sweden, it is served with tunebröd flatbread, boiled potatoes, diced onion, and sour cream. It is eaten outdoors, always outdoors. And it is considered a delicacy, a cultural touchstone, a marker of who you are and what you can endure. Number 15. Tonka beans across the EU. This was the spice that tasted like vanilla, caramel, and almonds and then gave you internal bleeding if you used too much. Tonka beans come from the Dipteryx odorata tree in South America. They are small, wrinkled, black, and intensely fragrant. Chefs have compared the flavor to the most complex version of vanilla you have ever tasted, with notes of almond, cherry, and clove underneath. For a decade or so in the early 2000s, they became quietly beloved in high-end European kitchens. Chefs grated them over desserts, stirred them into custards, shaved thin ribbons into cocktails. They were a secret weapon complex, affordable and almost impossible to replicate. They are banned in the EU for food use. The reason is coumarin, a naturally occurring compound in tonka beans that is present at very high concentrations. At low doses, coumarin is harmless. At high doses, and the dose is difficult to control because different beans carry different concentrations, it acts as an anticoagulant. It thins the blood. In overdose, it can cause liver damage and interfere with blood clotting in dangerous ways. The EU Food Safety Authority set a maximum daily tolerable intake of coumarin at 0.1 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. A single tonka bean contains enough coumarin to exceed that limit many times over. You cannot buy them as a food ingredient in the EU. You can buy them as a cosmetic fragrance ingredient. The line between those categories in European law is very specific and very strictly enforced. They are still used quietly, in some restaurant kitchens, by chefs who know the dose and know the risk and have decided the flavor is worth it. This is technically a criminal offense. This is a spice that tastes like the most beautiful thing you have ever eaten, and it will hurt you if you are not careful. Number 14. Met, Germany. This was the spread that required trust. In your butcher, in your meat, and in your immune system. Met is a traditional German dish, raw, seasoned, minced pork, typically mixed with onions, salt, pepper, and caraway seeds, and eaten spread on bread. It has been eaten in Germany for centuries. It appears at birthday breakfasts, Christmas markets, and Sunday mornings across the country. At some celebrations, it is shaped into the form of a hedgehog bristled with pretzel sticks and served as a centerpiece. It is raw pork, completely raw. No curing, no cooking, no heat applied. The EU has not outright banned met, but it occupies a deeply complicated legal and food safety space. Under EU food hygiene regulations, raw minced pork for direct consumption is subject to extraordinarily strict controls, specific cold chain requirements, microbiological testing, and time limits that make traditional production almost impossible at scale. The concern is real. Salmonella, Yersinia, and other pathogens can live in raw pork. Outbreaks have occurred. In Germany, it is still consumed widely, openly, legally, but with the understanding that it must be eaten fresh on the day of purchase from a trusted butcher who adheres to strict hygiene standards. Most EU countries, however, do not allow raw pork minced products to be sold for direct consumption without cooking. What is remarkable is not that it is dangerous. It is that, for most of German history, it was not. Because the pork was fresh, the butchers were known, the community was small, and the food moved from the animal to the table within hours, not days. Refrigerated shipping, industrial meat processing, and a global supply chain made raw pork dangerous in a way it never used to be. The food did not become more dangerous. The system around it did. Number 13. Beluga caviar. Across the EU. This was the luxury food that Europe banned to save a fish that had been swimming since before the dinosaurs. The beluga sturgeon, huso, is one of the oldest species on Earth. It can live for over 100 years. It does not begin reproducing until it is 25 years old. And its eggs, beluga caviar, are the most expensive food in the world. In peak years, they sold for $10,000 per kilogram. And so, for decades, the sturgeons were taken from the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea in enormous numbers. They were fished to the edge of extinction. Their populations collapsed by 90% over the course of the 20th century. By 2006, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species placed beluga sturgeon on its highest protection list. The EU banned the import and commercial sale of beluga caviar in 2007. This was not a ban on a dangerous food. This was a ban on a food that was eating itself, that was destroying the very thing that made it possible. Aquaculture operations have begun producing beluga caviar legally in some European countries under farm-raised conditions. The taste is considered exceptional. The ethical footprint is vastly better. But the wild-caught variety, the original, the one that tasted like cold seawater in deep time, is gone from European markets. What replaced it is technically the same food, but something in it is different, and anyone who has eaten both knows it. Number 12. Black pudding with lung, United Kingdom, EU. This was the breakfast that got caught in a border. Black pudding blood sausage is one of the oldest foods in Britain. It appears in Roman texts. It was eaten by medieval peasants, Tudor noblemen, and 20th century factory workers on identical Saturday mornings. It is made from pig's blood, fat, and a cereal filler, oats or barley, stuffed into a casing and cooked until it holds together. Traditional British black pudding, the kind made in Bury, in Lancashire, for centuries included pig's lung in the mixture. Lung added texture and bulk. It was a cheap, available, and nutritious ingredient that made the sausage go further. The EU banned the use of lung in meat products for human consumption in 1996. The stated reason was the risk of contamination from the respiratory tract. Gastric reflux can introduce stomach contents into the lung during slaughter, and the risk of bacterial contamination was considered too high for a product not guaranteed to reach a safe internal temperature during production. British black pudding makers had to reformulate. The lung came out, other fillers, oatmeal, and heavier proportions took its place. The Bury Black Pudding Company, and others, adapted. The product you buy today is compliant. It is very good. It is technically not the same as what was made before 1996. After Brexit, the question of whether the UK would restore lung to black pudding production became, for a brief period, an actual political conversation. It was discussed in Parliament. It was referenced in trade negotiations. That is how much this matters. A sausage, a lung, a border, and a country quietly deciding who it wanted to be. Number 11. Wild boar and mushrooms from Chernobyl zones, Central Europe. This was the food that the disaster made. In 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The fallout spread across a vast swath of Eastern and Central Europe, depositing cesium-137 into the soil of forests in Ukraine, Belarus, Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and the Alps. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, which means it is still there. Right now, tonight, and certain organisms absorb it with extraordinary efficiency. Mushrooms, especially the species that grow in forest litter, bioaccumulate cesium at rates many times higher than the surrounding soil, and wild boar eat those mushrooms. They root through the contaminated forest floor, eating fungi, roots, and soil organisms that have been pulling cesium out of the ground for nearly 4 decades. In Germany's Bavaria region, wild boar meat is tested regularly, and a significant proportion still exceeds the EU legal limit of 600 becquerels per kilogram for radioactive contamination. In some areas, the measurements have come in at over 10 times the legal limit. The EU ban on selling contaminated wild game is entirely real and actively enforced. Hunters in affected zones are required to have their kills tested. Meat that fails the test cannot be sold, but it can be kept and eaten, and sometimes it is. Because in rural communities where hunting is a tradition and wild boar is a significant food source, and the deer seem fine and the hunter feels fine and the test result is a number from a government agency 300 kilometers away, sometimes the food wins. This is the only item on this list that is radioactive, and it is not a food from history, it is a food from last hunting season. Number 10. Colt's foot in food products. AU-wide. This was the herb that healers used for 1,000 years, and then the scientists looked more closely. Coltsfoot Tussilago farfara is a plant with a long tradition in European folk medicine. Its name in Latin means cough suppressant. For centuries it was used to make herbal teas, throat lozenges, cough syrups, and in some traditions a flavoring in sweets and confectionery. In Germany, it was an ingredient in traditional Husten bonbons cough candies. In Eastern European countries, it was used in herbal blends sold in pharmacies. Then in the 1980s, research identified pyrrolizidine alkaloids in the plant compounds that, with prolonged exposure, are hepatotoxic. They damage the liver. In animal studies, they cause tumors. The EU progressively restricted and then effectively banned the use of coltsfoot as a food ingredient across member states. Products containing it were recalled. Traditional herbal candy manufacturers had to reformulate. The irony is precise and uncomfortable. A plant used to heal for 1,000 years, freely, cheaply, by ordinary people with no access to pharmaceutical care, removed from the market by the scientific evidence that its healing properties came with a cost that accumulated over time. Nobody was dying of coltsfoot candy. Nobody was going to. But the precautionary principle says, if something can cause harm over a lifetime of exposure, restrict it. And so the cough candy changed. And the older generation who remembered the original looked at the new version and said, quietly, that it was not the same. They were right. It wasn't. Number 9. Pennyroyal Historical and Contemporary EU Restriction. This was the herb that women used in desperation. And that is all that needs to be said for a moment before we go further. Pennyroyal Mentha pelagium is a member of the mint family. It grows wild across Europe. It has been used in cooking as a flavoring in black pudding in some regions, in lamb dishes, in herb liqueurs since Roman times. It was also used for centuries as an abortifacient. High doses of pennyroyal oil cause uterine contractions. This was known. It was documented in ancient texts, in medieval herbals, in women's knowledge passed down through generations in ways that left few written records because such knowledge was not always safe to write down. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as access to safe abortion was restricted or non-existent across most of Europe, pennyroyal oil remained used in extremis, in desperation, in privacy, with real risk. The oil is genuinely dangerous in the doses required to induce miscarriage. It can cause liver failure and death. The EU restricts the use of pelargone, the primary compound in pennyroyal, as a flavoring in food products. The limits are strict. Pennyroyal oil as a supplement or medicinal product is banned in most member states. As a culinary herb in very small quantities, it remains. But the knowledge that surrounded it, the ancient, complicated, gendered knowledge of what this plant could do to a body, that is a different story. Number 8. Cashew marzu's closest cousin. Raw milk, soft cheeses across EU borders. This was the cheese that France refused to give up, and that is exactly as French as it sounds. Unpasteurized milk cheeses, Brie de Meaux, Camembert de Normandie, Roquefort have been made in France for centuries. They are made from raw milk, which means the milk has not been heat-treated to kill pathogens. The bacteria in raw milk are part of the flavor. They are part of the terroir. French cheesemakers will tell you with complete sincerity that pasteurizing their cheese is not making it safer, it is killing it. And they have a point. The EU has extensive and complicated regulations around raw milk cheeses. Many traditionally made, unpasteurized soft cheeses cannot be legally exported to non-EU countries. The United States, Australia, Canada, and others have outright bans on raw milk cheeses aged less than 60 days. The EU's internal regulations require strict hygiene controls at the farm and dairy level. But the ban I want to talk about is subtler and more interesting. Several EU countries, including Germany, for a period, and with ongoing restrictions, restrict or prohibit the retail sale of certain raw milk products. In Scotland, raw milk can only be sold directly from registered producers to consumers. In other member states, unpasteurized milk cannot be sold at retail at all. The argument is simple. Raw milk carries Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, and Campylobacter, risks that pasteurization eliminates. Children, elderly people, and immunocompromised individuals face real risk. The counterargument, made loudly and passionately by French cheesemakers for decades, is that the risk in traditionally made raw milk cheese, aged, rinded, produced under strict conditions, is not the same as the risk in a glass of raw milk, and that losing the raw milk tradition means losing the flavor tradition, means losing the cheese, means losing something that took centuries to build and cannot be rebuilt once it is gone. Both sides are right. That is the problem, and it is still not resolved. Number 7. Fugu liver. Pufferfish EU import restrictions. This was the meal where the chef's skill was the only thing standing between you and death. Fugu pufferfish is not a European food, it is Japanese. But it arrived in European consciousness through the back door of the import market and the high-end restaurant scene, and the EU's position on it is worth examining. The EU bans the import of fugu livers, gonads, and skin the parts of the fish that contain tetrodotoxin, one of the most potent neurotoxins known to science. Tetrodotoxin has no antidote. A lethal dose is extraordinarily small. It paralyzes the respiratory muscles and kills through asphyxiation. In Japan, fugu can only be prepared by chefs who hold a special license, a multi-year qualification that involves learning precisely which parts of the fish contain the toxin, how to remove them without contaminating the edible flesh, and how to recognize when the preparation has failed. The EU does not recognize that license. Fugu flesh, properly prepared, toxin-free, can technically be imported and served in EU restaurants, but the regulatory burden is immense. The restaurants that have tried to offer it legally have faced challenges at every step of the supply chain. Meanwhile, fugu liver, which contains the highest concentration of toxin and which is in Japan the most prized and most dangerous component, is simply not allowed. At all. This is perhaps the most defensible ban on this list. Tetrodotoxin is not a risk that culture and tradition can mitigate. There is no amount of experience that makes it safe to eat without proper preparation. So, we are past the halfway point. And I want to say something that I think is true, even though it is uncomfortable. These foods did not exist because of recklessness. They did not exist because the people who made them did not care about safety. They existed because the people who made them had no other choice. The fermented shark, the maggot cheese, the blood sausage stretched with lung, the raw milk that was the only milk available, processed the only way available, with the knowledge that was available. These foods were engineering. They were solutions. They were the product of generations of accumulated knowledge that had no other way of being preserved except by being eaten, by being passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from shepherd to shepherd, from the memory of one bad winter into the planning for the next one. And the knowledge is fragile. Once the village that knew how to make something stops making it because it is banned, or embarrassing, or inconvenient, that knowledge is gone. There is no archive. There is no recovery. I am not saying these foods should all be legal. Some of them should not be. Some of the bans are right. But I am saying know what you are losing. Know the weight of it. Before the last person who knows how to bury a Greenlandic shark in the exact right gravel for the exact right number of days puts down the shovel for the last time. Number 6. Caffeinated alcohol, EU-wide. This was the drink that fooled you. For a decade or so in the 2000s, pre-mixed caffeinated alcoholic drinks, most famously Four Loko in the United States, but with numerous European equivalents under various brand names, were a significant market. The formula was simple: high alcohol content combined with caffeine, guarana, and taurine in quantities that masked the sedative effect of the alcohol. The danger was this: caffeine suppresses the body's natural signal that it has consumed enough alcohol. Normally, when you are very drunk, you become sleepy. Your body is telling you to stop. Caffeine overrides that signal. You feel alert. You feel capable of continuing. but your blood alcohol level is continuing to rise, and your judgment is continuing to fall. And the gap between what you feel and what is actually happening in your body grows and grows until the consequences arrive without warning. The EU did not issue a single clean ban on caffeinated alcoholic drinks. The response was fragmented. Some countries banned specific products under national food law, others issued health warnings, and the European Food Safety Authority issued guidance on maximum caffeine doses in beverages. But the combination of regulatory pressure and high-profile incidents, hospitalizations, alcohol poisonings, and in the United States, the FDA effectively forcing the product off the market in 2010 led most European manufacturers to either reformulate or discontinue the products. What replaced them were energy drinks sold separately alongside alcohol. The combination is still legal, it is consumed everywhere. Number 5. Sassafras oil and saffrole-containing foods. This was the root beer that became a controlled substance. Sassafras. Sassafras albidum is a tree native to North America, but its root extract was historically used in European herbal medicine and as a flavoring in certain beverages and folk remedies imported through trade routes. The bark and root contain saffrole, a compound that was once a key ingredient in traditional root beer. In the 1960s, the US FDA banned saffrole as a food additive after animal studies showed it caused liver cancer in rats at high doses. The EU followed with its own restrictions under food additive regulations. But the story goes further than root beer. Saffrole is a precursor chemical in the synthesis of MDMA, the psychoactive compound in ecstasy, which means sassafras oil is not just a banned food flavoring. It is a watched, regulated, and in many contexts, controlled substance because of what it can be chemically converted into. This is one of the stranger items on the list. A tree root extract, used in folk medicine for centuries, banned first for being carcinogenic in rats, and then additionally controlled because it turned out to be the starting material for a recreational drug that would define an entire generation's nightlife. Number 4. Poppy seeds above opiate thresholds, Germany and EU. This was the bread roll that failed a drug test. Poppy seeds come from Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. The seeds themselves contain only trace amounts of morphine and codeine, but those traces are real and measurable. Eating a poppy seed bagel before a workplace drug screening has caused people to test positive for opiates. This is documented. This happens. But the regulatory story in Europe is more specific than that. Germany, which has one of the highest per capita poppy seed consumption rates in Europe, with traditional baked goods like Mohnkuchen and Mohnstrudel beloved across the country, discovered in the early 2000s that certain poppy seed supplies, particularly those from certain Eastern European and Central Asian sources, contained morphine concentrations many times higher than standard food-grade levels. The reason: harvesting method. Some suppliers were sourcing seeds from partially lanced poppy heads pods that had been scored to collect opium latex, then allowed to dry, with the seeds carrying residual morphine from the extraction process. The EU set maximum morphine limits for poppy seeds used in food, currently 14 milligrams per kilogram for whole seeds for bakery and fine bakery wares. Seeds exceeding this limit cannot be legally sold as food. In practice, this meant that some traditional European bakeries found their regular suppliers suddenly non-compliant, and some traditional recipes using larger quantities of seeds had to adjust their sourcing. Nobody was getting high from Mohnkuchen. But somebody was supplying seeds from a process that was connected to opium production, and the European food safety system eventually noticed. The poppy seed bagel survived. The supply chain got more complicated. Number 3. Certain wild mushrooms at retail, various EU countries. This was the harvest that required a grandparent. Wild mushroom foraging is deeply embedded in the culture of much of Central and Eastern Europe. In Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Germany, in Italy, families go to the forest every autumn. They know which paths to walk. They know which trees host which species. They know the difference between the sep and the death cap by smell, by color, by the way the stem breaks. That knowledge is transferred in person, in the woods, not in a book. The EU and its member states have imposed varying restrictions on the sale of wild mushrooms at retail markets. The concern is real. Amanita phalloides, the death cap, kills people every year across Europe, usually immigrants who confuse it with edible species from their home countries. Identifying mushrooms safely requires expertise that cannot be verified at a market stall. Germany requires wild mushroom sellers to have an official mycological certification. France requires identification at licensed inspection points. Several countries prohibit the retail sale of certain wild species entirely. This is another example of a ban that is simultaneously entirely correct and profoundly sad. Because what the regulation cannot replace is the grandmother who knew. The one who walked you into the forest when you were 6 years old and put a mushroom in your hand and said, "Smell this, remember this smell. This one is safe. This one is not. This one will kill you before morning." That knowledge lives in hands and noses and memories. It does not live in a certificate, and the certificate is necessary precisely because the knowledge is disappearing. Number 2. Unpasteurized raw milk for retail sale. Multiple EU countries. This was the milk that tasted like the farm, and then it tasted like bureaucracy. Raw milk, unpasteurized, unprocessed, drunk directly from the animal was what milk was for the vast majority of human history. Pasteurization, developed by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s, became widespread in the 20th century and dramatically reduced deaths from milk-borne illnesses: tuberculosis, listeria, E. coli, salmonella. The science on pasteurization is clear. It saves lives. This is not contested. And yet, raw milk has a devoted following across Europe, farmers and consumers who argue that the live bacteria, enzymes, and complex fatty acids in raw milk are not just safe. When the cow and the dairy are managed properly, they are nutritionally and gastronomically superior to the pasteurized version in ways that are genuinely measurable. In Scotland, raw milk sales from registered farms direct to consumers are legal but strictly regulated. In England and Wales, similar restrictions apply. In Germany, retail raw milk sales are banned, but farm gate sales buying directly from the farmer are permitted. In France, raw milk vending machines are increasingly popular, operating at farm locations. In Sweden, Denmark, and several other EU countries, retail sale of raw milk is simply banned. The patchwork of rules reflects a genuine disagreement that has not been resolved. What is clear is this: in communities where the cow is known, the farmer is trusted, the milk travels meters, not kilometers, and the hygiene is maintained by someone who knows that their reputation and their livelihood depend on the health of their customers. Raw milk has a safety record that the regulations do not fully account for. What is also clear is that industrial raw milk, drawn from hundreds of animals, pooled in tanks, transported long distances, and sold through retail, is a different product entirely and carries different risks. Number 1. Haggis with lungs, Scotland, United States, EU cross-border. This was the national dish of a nation, and then it was banned. Haggis is the soul of Scottish cooking. It is sheep's heart, liver, and lung, minced with onion, oatmeal, suet, and spices, stuffed into the animal's stomach, and then boiled for several hours. It has been eaten in Scotland since at least the 15th century. It appears in poetry. Robert Burns wrote an ode to it in 1787. Addressed to a Haggis, which is still recited across Scotland every Burns night, every 25th of January, at tables set with whiskey and candlelight. It is considered formally the national dish of Scotland. The United States banned haggis with lung in 1971. The USDA determined that livestock lungs were not fit for human consumption under American food safety law, citing contamination risks during slaughter. The EU, and this is the critical part, also restricted the use of lung in meat products under its 1,996 food hygiene directives. which means traditional haggis, made in the traditional way with lung as a key ingredient, is not legal to sell commercially within EU markets. For a decade after Brexit, there was ongoing discussion about whether the UK would restore lung to commercial haggis production now that it was no longer bound by EU directives. It did not, immediately. The practical concerns about meeting export standards and the manufacturing realities of reformulated recipes kept the lung-free version dominant in commercial production. Scottish producers can still make traditional haggis with lung for their own use. They cannot sell it in the UK's mainstream retail market without navigating significant regulatory hurdles. And so the national dish of Scotland, the dish that Robert Burns called Great Chieftain o' the Puddin' Race, exists in a legal form that its inventor would not entirely recognize. In Burns night homes across Scotland, there are families who make the real version, the one with the lung, the one that has been made the same way for 5 centuries. They make it at home. They do not talk about it particularly loudly. And they eat it by candlelight with whiskey in hand while someone recites the words that were written for it. We have come to the end of the list. 20 foods, 20 bands, 20 stories about the line between danger and tradition, between safety and loss, between the world we are building and the world we are leaving behind. If this video changed the way you see food, then you're going to want to stay with us. Subscribe to Forgotten European Foods for more lost, banned, and forgotten stories from Europe's past. And tell me in the comments, which one would you actually dare to try? I read every comment. And Forgotten European Foods will see you in the next one.